there were militia units from Opelousas, Louisiana, which were mainly French, who had refused to live in Mobile under British rule because they were French, and they were allowed by Galvez to move to Opelousas, Louisiana. So the only French involved in the American Revolution were not just the ones that came over with the Marquis de Lafayette. There were expat French that moved to Louisiana and fought besides the Spanish.
You are listening to History Man, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are very fortunate to have Harold Gonzalez Jr., a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel and doctor in education. He is a life member of both the South Carolina and Louisiana Society Sons of the American Revolution. So welcome, Harold.
Thank you.
Harold, I am very excited about this particular episode because it introduces not just myself, but it introduces our listeners to the role that the Spanish played in the American Revolution, and something we hardly ever hear about, especially here on the East Coast. But while, especially around 1779 and forward, the Spanish actually played a significant role in the Mississippi Valley and the entrance to the Mississippi River in what was considered Western Florida. Is that correct?
That is correct. What most people don't remember or don't realize is after the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, there were actually 15 colonies because the British inherited from the French Florida and West Florida, which would have been really 14 and 15 colonies. East Florida had no desire to join with the other American colonies in the American Revolution. They were very much British subjects and were happy that way. West Florida was sort of in flux, I guess is what you could say. The people didn't revolt, but they were not as tied to Great Britain for a couple of reasons, as I'll talk about in a bit. But you have to remember there was a lot of loyalty to France by a lot of the people in West Florida because, of course, West Florida had been settled by the French.
Sure. Let me cut you off for just a second. For our listeners, when you talk about West Florida, you're not just talking about the Panhandle. You're not just talking about Pensacola. You're saying even further west and north of there. What did West Florida encompass at that time?
West Florida went from just east of Pensacola all the way to the Mississippi River north of Lake Pontchartrain. So it was a pretty big expanse of land that butted right up against the Spanish colonial holdings in New Orleans and the west bank of the Mississippi River.
So the northern boundary of that, would that be like the northern boundary of the Panhandle of Florida now, or did it go further north?
If you extended that line all the way to the Mississippi, you'd be close.
Okay.
The interesting thing, though, was that New Orleans, Spain held both sides of the Mississippi, both the east and the west bank. So even though the British owned the east bank of the Mississippi all the way up to Canada, they didn't own the mouth of the river, so the Spanish were able to control who was able to use the Mississippi.
It puts it in perspective, too. I know that when the Indian agents dealing with the Cherokee, they had to go towards, they left before the Cherokee attacked, when Andrew Pickens and that force attacked Seneca. The Indian agent actually went west to Mobile and that area over there. That would have been considered West Florida, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So how did the Spanish enter into all this?
Well, remember the Spanish, of course, west of the Mississippi had always been in Spanish hands down into Mexico because they were the ones that discovered that. The French, of course, under La Salle, discovered the mouth of the Mississippi River, and that gave them claim to the Mississippi all the way up into Canada. The British, if you look at a map, and it's too bad we can't show them a map of the United States back then, but remember, prior to the 7 Years' War, the British owned a little swath along the eastern seaboard, which were the 13 colonies, and two sections of Canada. But the center of Canada, Quebec, which is still French speaking, was owned by France all the way down to, if you extended that all the way down to the mouth of the Mississippi, that was all French held. So the English, prior to the French and Indian War, were really the least real estate owners in the New World.
I think I saw somewhere, it might have been some of the information that you gave me, that the French were actually in Nova Scotia at that time before the French and Indian War as well. And then when the British won the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, those Acadians moved to Louisiana and other parts of the continent. Is that correct?
They were actually expelled from Newfoundland by the British. They didn't want any French influence in that part of the world.
Oh, okay.
But it's interesting that prior or during the initial colonization, the French really were there to get furs. They were there to trade. Which is why the most indigenous people supported the French during the French and Indian War, because they never were looking to take territory. They were only looking to trade. On the other hand, the English, going all the way back to Plymouth, were always wanting to have land. And the Native Americans pretty quickly realized that a neighbor like that sooner or later was going to try to take your land, not just be a good neighbor to you. Whereas the French, other than, they established Quebec and they established trading posts, but they didn't really have the influx of colonists that the Native Americans saw the British doing.
What happened after the French and Indian War then? Because when we talk about French and Indian War, we do have a tendency to kind of be narrow-minded about this continent, but that was really a worldwide conflict involving France and Spain and all of their territories, going all the way, possibly, if I recall correctly, going all the way to India. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, the 7 Years' War was much more than just a war in the New World. As a matter of fact, the British acquired Gibraltar, and in a lot of respects, it was very much a war on almost a global scale in the Northern Hemisphere, because, as you said, parts of India were taken over, parts of Gibraltar and different parts of Europe were taken over by different entities during the war. Now, we only think about what happened in North America, but it was a much larger war than we give it credit for.
And even in the West Indies, talking about all the different islands down there, they were claiming this island when the next nation was claiming the next island. It was, and they were continually fighting over those all the way through the Revolutionary War and even beyond.
And that's what becomes very interesting when you look at pre and post 7 Years' War, because the French basically lost all of their territory in North America, with the exception of Haiti. Haiti was maintained as their only colonial outpost in the Caribbean. So you can see why the French were willing to join the American Revolution in hopes of regaining some of that territory that they had lost. Now, on the other hand, and this would take a whole other podcast, but you have to remember the King of Spain and the King of France were cousins. So even when we talk about the transfer of power from the French to the Spanish, there are some historians that have argued that really Spain was a puppet of France. And it was sort of like France was letting them manage the territory, but France was still getting benefits from their management of the territory, even though on paper they gave it to them. Now, in Louisiana, where we're talking about, initially, the French in Louisiana, especially in New Orleans, did not want to go under Spanish rule. And there was actually a revolt, and the Spanish had to send a force from Havana to New Orleans. There was never any fighting as such, but it took about a year for the transfer of New Orleans from France to Spain. So there was a lot of political intrigue going on with this transfer of land. And the interesting thing is, in 1791, a lot of people don't realize this, but that's when the revolution took place in Haiti. And the Haitian Revolution could be called the Second America's Revolution because they tried to establish independence from France. They were put down, and a lot of the Haitians then migrated to Louisiana after our War of Independence was over, but they tried to do the same thing to the French in Haiti.
That ties us even closer to Haiti than I ever imagined. That's interesting. Tell me a little bit about who Bernardo de Galvez is, and how does he figure into all this?
When Spain takes over control of Louisiana, their first governor is a man by the name of Gonzaga. And Gonzaga comes in again with that turmoil I was talking about, where the French citizens didn't really want to become Spanish, and he brings in the force that puts them down. And then through political undermining in Spain, he ends up being pushed out of power, and a new governor is appointed, and that is Bernardo de Galvez. Now, Gonzaga already had started to support the Americans. He was smuggling stuff up through the Mississippi River to the American patriots. But Galvez came to America with a mandate from the Spanish crown to support the Americans. And at some point, we are going to get involved in this conflict because the French were already involved.
So we're not talking about 1775 or 1776. We're actually talking closer to 1779.
1778, 79.
Right.
And
for South Carolina, this is about the time that the British have decided to come back south after failing in the north. They're deciding to start the southern campaigns. Is that about
That's
the
correct.
same time period? Yeah. Okay.
And that is going to coordinate closely to when Galvez, well, first the Spanish do declare war.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason the history books, I think, miss the Spanish involvement in the American Revolution is because first Spain tried to be a neutral nation and negotiate a peace treaty between the British and the Americans. And the first tenet of that treaty was going to be that America would be independent. Well, the British wouldn't buy that. Well, then when Spain declared war, they declared war on the British, but they did not recognize the United States as an entity. Now, you can understand why, because Spain had a huge colonial empire. So, it's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I don't want these other countries or these other colonies to decide they want to be independent. Yet, if you look at the history up to today, they end up losing Mexico because of a revolution. They end up losing many of the South American colonies because of revolutions. So this was the first revolution, and they were probably smart to not want to go all in and recognize the Americans as an independent nation.
They didn't come to the table with just a few troops or just lip service or a signed paperwork. They actually came with a significant amount of ships and men to the battle, so to speak.
Well, but it was, to them, it was an independent battle to capture. There was no coordination between the French and the Spanish and the Americans, except for the fact that the French and Spanish fleets did cooperate with each other. And when de Grasse goes to Yorktown to support Washington at the siege of Yorktown with the French fleet, the Spanish fleet guards the Caribbean from the British. So the fleet influence in the American Revolution has been underappreciated, I think, because imagine how many different entities the British were having to deal with in the New World during the American Revolution. We sort of think of it as the only fleet was de Grasse going to Yorktown to support the siege, but in reality, the French and the Spanish fleets had been given the British fits because they couldn't do any trade. They couldn't really effectively blockade the Caribbean because of all the Spanish and privateers and French fleets that were involved in that area.
Well, tell me about you had mentioned to me three main battles that the Spanish were involved in on North American soil during this time. One of them was Manchac, another was Baton Rouge, and the other one was Pensacola. Well, you had Mobile also. Talk to me about them.
Okay, well, when again, once Spain declared war, Galvez's battle plan was to capture Manchac, which is on the east bank of the Mississippi, which was a small fort, and then Baton Rouge, which was a pretty large fort. And within a 2-week campaign, he was able to capture both of those forts. And he also got the British commander to surrender Natchez, which now gives basically the Spanish the west and the east bank of the Mississippi all the way to St. Louis.
When was that?
I'm going to add first, Galvez's forces were made up of what was called the Fixed Spanish Regiment of Louisiana, which had actually they had been recruited from the Canary Islands. And my seventh great grandfather, who was a Dominguez, that is why I am a member of the Sons of the American Revolution. Also, there were militia units from Opelousas, Louisiana, which were mainly French, who had refused to live in Mobile under British rule because they were French, and they were allowed by Galvez to move to Opelousas, Louisiana. So the only French involved in the American Revolution were not just the ones that came over with the Marquis the Lafayette. There were expat French that moved to Louisiana and fought besides the Spanish in this campaign we're talking about. So Galvez had sort of a mixed militia, not all Spanish, when he attacked Fort Butte, which he did on September the 7th, 1779. Now, Fort Butte was just a small redoubt, actually located on the border, because there's a bayou in Louisiana called Bayou Manchac. And when we talked about the extension of West Florida all the way to the Mississippi, Bayou Manchac was the northern border of what the British owned in Louisiana along that little sliver that we call West Florida or British West Florida at this time. So on the 12th of September 1779, he attacks Manchac and captures it, and then he's able to move north to Baton Rouge, which is the main fort, and that has 400 British and Waldeck German mercenaries, as well as about 150 settlers and Negroes and 13 cannon. And Galvez encircled the fort and by deception was able to build a battery close enough to bombard the fort, and it quickly surrendered to him. Now, an American patriot very few people have heard of, Oliver Pollock. He was the American representative in New Orleans, but he was also Galvez's aide de camp. And he led the negotiations with the British Colonel Alexander Dickinson and convinced him that they might as well give up Natchez also. So when the British surrendered, the Spanish now controlled the Mississippi on the east and west bank from New Orleans all the way to St. Louis.
That's a pretty significant situation that occurred right there in 1779, in between the Battle of Stono Ferry and the actual capitulation at the Siege of Charleston. I mean, that's a pretty significant thing. But you said, I think I recall you saying that this was not that in no way made this attack in conjunction with any American attack that was going on.
That's correct.
Right.
I wonder if the British weren't forced to fight in South Carolina when they did because of the pressure they were beginning to feel from the Spanish in the South, as well as from the Patriots in the South. Because, as we're going to see, they lose a considerable amount of real estate to both the South Carolina Patriots and to the Spanish in the South before they have to withdraw to Williamsburg.
Okay. Well, talk to me what happens next.
Okay, on January the 11th, now we're into 1780, Galvez organized a fleet of 12 ships to carry 754 men to attack Mobile. Now, the convoy ran into, guess what? A hurricane, which was sort of early. I mean, you'd have thought January 11th was not hurricane season back then, but they ran into a significant storm, probably more like what we call a nor'easter these days. But and the fleet suffered considerable problems, but they decided to press on to Mobile. Now, the interesting thing is General Campbell, who was in command of the British troops in Pensacola, he hears about Galvez invading Mobile. So he sends a relief force toward Mobile, hoping to capture Galvez's men on the beach from their sunk ships. And it wasn't as bad as I guess his reports were. So Galvez, with his 750 men, or now have Campbell with 1,000 men heading from Pensacola to relieve Mobile. But the next day, the Spanish began to bombard the fort. And I often wonder, as I just told you, there was a certain number of ex-French soldiers fighting with Galvez who had been stationed in Mobile. And within one day, they were able to knock a hole in the fort at Mobile, and the Spanish attacked and literally captured the fort, and they could see Campbell's relief force coming toward them. And once Campbell saw that the fort had been captured, he turned around and went back to Pensacola. But that would be real odd to be able to breach a fort within one day unless you knew of the weaknesses of the fort.
You're thinking that there was some inside information or inside help on that.
Correct.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
I think it would, the fact that he had a group of men who had been stationed in that fort would have given you a lot of inside information on what the weaknesses were of Fort Condé. Now, the funny thing is, have you ever driven Interstate 10 through Mobile?
I have, yeah.
Fort
Condé is right off the interstate right there.
The Bankhead Tunnel that goes under Mobile Bay, where it pops out in downtown Mobile, that's where the fort was.
The fort that's there now, that Fort Condé Fort, is that a reproduction?
Yep.
Is it on the same place?
It's the exact same place.
It's a pretty formidable fort, as I recall. It's not like a little palisaded redoubt that you would find in the backcountry. It's a pretty solid fort.
That's correct. Now, going along with what we were talking about, remember in May, now we're into 1780. So in May 12th, 1780, Charleston falls.
Right.
To the British. May 29th of 1780, you have the Battle of Waxhaws. It isn't until July the 11th of 1780 that the French arrive in Newport, Rhode Island. On October the 7th, 1780, you have the Battle of Kings Mountain. And January 17th, 1781 is the Battle of Cowpens. So that gives you just a little historical context of what was going on in South Carolina at the same time that the invasion of Pensacola was taking place.
You may not know this. I'm going to ask this question. You said that Galvez, after the storm, the nor'eastern that took out a bunch of his ships, he got reinforcements from where?
He got reinforcements from New Orleans and from Cuba.
Made up of Spanish soldiers?
Spanish soldiers.
Were there militia along with that? No. Were there French militia or anything like that?
The militia were from Louisiana.
I see. Okay.
But each of the different colonies under Spanish rule, like Havana, they had militia. But Louisiana was sort of unique in that you had these French that had come over. You had Germans that had come over from actually Switzerland through Germany that had settled in Louisiana on what was called the German coast, which was just north of New Orleans. So there were Germans actually fighting with Galvez in some of his militia units. The Point Coupé militia were heavily German. So he had sort of a multinational unit. But the funny thing is, remember there are SAR chapters all the way to California, because the Spanish were being supported not only from Louisiana, but everything west of the Mississippi was supporting Galvez with beef, with iron, with lead. So even from Mexico, the Spanish were drawing resources and reinforcements because it was a Spanish campaign.